Okay, so when George gets to the organ and he's going to start playing the music to kind of get the congregation to take their seats before service starts, when the organ is getting ready to play, we're going to unmute the organ. And then when George starts to play, it's all set up to go with it.
This is the organ. Okay.
And then the board is set up for the organ to start playing, so you don't have to do any other changes to it. So then the next part is, once George is done playing the welcome greeting, pastor typically walks up to the front to do his greeting. So this is where it changes, because now you're going to have to turn on the microphones. So when pastor walks up to the front to talk to the congregation with his little welcome message, we will turn on all three mics up at the altar and the pulpit and the lectern to be able to pick up his voice, since he's not physically at a microphone. The second thing you have to do is, on the Facebook feed, you're going to have to bump the volume up to typically -15, so then you can actually hear his voice, because it's going to be very soft because he's not on a mic. Then pastor gets done with his welcome message, and the organ is going to start playing the opening hymn. With that, you're going to mute the lectern and the pulpit. We're going to leave the altar on, because that's the microphone that's going to pick up the congregation singing. And then you're going to have to go back to the Facebook feed, and you're going to bring this down to -24. So anytime the organ's on, you always got to have it -24, otherwise it's just too much for the Facebook viewers at home. Then once that is done and the opening hymn is done, pastor usually starts with his invocation, his opening sentences, and his confession and absolution. So the first thing we're going to have to do is, now that we need to pick up pastor speaking, anytime you're on a focus mic for somebody talking, you're going to bump it up to 3. So this line in the middle is 0, so anything above here is a positive, anything below is negative. So we're going to move that mic to 3. What happens is, during this, pastor's going to do two things. He's going to be standing at the altar facing the congregation speaking, and he's also going to be then facing the altar with his back to the congregation speaking. So this setup right here, as you see, with just the altar on, is when pastor's at the altar, facing the altar, speaking. But what you also have to do is, you're going to be able just to leave this at between -20 and -22, again, because he is on a microphone, he is loud. Now if pastor then turns to the congregation at the altar and speaks to us, then what you have to do is you have to turn on the pulpit microphone just for a little extra, because again, this microphone's at his back, this is at his side, so that'll pick him up. But then we have to go back to the Facebook volume, and we have to move it to -15 for that little extra boost to hear him. So after that, typically, and then so during that service, pastor will, turn around, and then you have to make these adjustments. And so you can leave the pulpit on, that is okay. If you're not able to keep up with turning on and turning off mics, if you just leave both on, you're covered. The only thing you do have to make sure you manage is the Facebook feed, because if you have it too loud for pastor at the altar speaking to the altar, it'll be all garbled on the Facebook feed. So this is more important, to manage which way he's facing. And again, after that, the Kyrie and the hymn of praise will start, and that's when you're going to go, again, you're going to want to move it back down to -24 for the organ. And again, what I usually do is mute the pulpit, and then this will give you a clear sound for the congregation singing. After that, pastor will usually come back to the front, face the altar, to give his message of salutation and prayer for the day. And again, we're going to leave the altar on, and we got to move this down just to -22, so it's not too much. After that, then it's time for the readings. And with the readings, you're going to have to, again, mute the altar, and we're going to turn on the lectern. We're going to move the last one here, and it's labeled. And then we're going to have to now move this microphone to 3 and this microphone back to -5 because we want the system to say focus on this microphone. When you do this, that's when you start hearing the people over the speakers. Same thing with pastor at the altar. When you make it the primary, you hear it over the speakers inside church. So the reader's reading, typically, and again it depends on the person. Some people are soft-spoken, some people are loud-spoken. So, for example, when Jim talks, he's at like a -20 or 22. When somebody else like Gail is like a -17. So you will have to just kind of adjust to find out, if you feel that they're softer, you're going to make it a little more closer to -17, 18. If they're more loud, then you're going to do them -20 to -22. So that happens there. Some Sundays it's just the two readings and then we move to the gospel. But on those Sundays that we have the choir singing, you will have to make a change. So let's just say, for example, the Old Testament reading just happened and the choir is going to go up. What we have to do is I leave the lectern on like this. I don't change that at all, but I also have to turn on the altar. For this specific time, we're trying to pick up the choir with microphones at their back, so we do have to bump up the Facebook volume to typically -18. Well, the only negative effect of that is now the organ's going to be too loud, so you're going to have to move the organ down to like -32 to quiet that down a little bit. Then after the organ's done playing, we're getting ready for the epistle reading. Now we got to go back to what we were set at, so we're going to move the organ back to -28. We're going to move to altar, and we're all set up for the epistle reading. Once the epistle's done, pastor's going to do the gospel. So again, we're going to have to now change. We're going to turn off the lectern, move it down to -5. We're going to turn on the pulpit, because that's where pastor's going to read from. And we bump it up to 3. And then again, with pastor talking, pastor is always a -22 on the mic. He has a lot of voice to him, so we don't want to make it too overpowering for the Facebook viewers. And that's set up like that. After we're done with the gospel reading, typically we have the hymn of the day. And again, just like every other song, we're going to turn on the altar, turn off the pulpit. You don't have to worry about changing the microphone frequency because with the organ, that's not too concerning. And then we're going to have to move it back down to -24. And then after that, then pastor will typically give his sermon. But pastor's been doing the children's message. And what happens is he comes he's not even on the altar, he's off the altar, so you really got to pick him up. So we got to turn on all the mics to get as much maximum pickup from him. And we typically have to move this to -15 to -10 depending on how far off the altar he is. And then that allows us to pick up pastor's voice when he's not close to a microphone. And then pastor gets done with his message to the children. He's going to give a sermon. We're going to mute the lectern, mute the altar. We're going to then move this back down to -24 because again -22 because pastor's on the mic and we're set up there for the sermon. And then once the sermon's usually completed, then we're going to move into the typically a creed. So pastor usually turns to the side at the pulpit and faces the altar. So the nice part about that is we can still leave the pulpit on. We're going to want to turn on the altar because we want to hear the congregation reading also. But we will have to bump this to -18 because now that pastor's not physically on the mic, but he's close to it. We have to pick him up a little bit. After the creed is completed, pastor physically moves to the altar for prayers. And when he does that, again, we got to move him back to -22 because we're going to put him on the altar mic. So again, we're going to move this down to -5.
Okay, show that again.
Oh, sure. So this is where the pulpit was at because pastor was giving the sermon. So now he has moved to the altar to do the prayers. So we're going to move this down to -5. We want to focus on the altar for the congregation to hear, so that goes to 3. And then we mute the pulpit. And then this just focuses on pastor facing the altar, giving the prayers. Prayers get done, we do the collection. Now this, with just music, there's no singing that goes with the congregation. So you can leave this on if you so choose, or you can mute it, which gives a little bit more clear sound to the organ. There's no fault if you leave this on or off. It's just more clear if you can mute all the microphones and it's just receiving an organ. Once the collection is done, then pastor moves to the start of the sacrament. Again, this part, pastor will again face the altar and speak, and he'll turn to the congregation to speak. So again, what I usually do, just in case, so I'm caught up, I always leave the pulpit and the altar microphones on. I leave the altar as the primary for voice in here, because when he's facing us, we can all hear him. But when his back's to us, we can't hear him real well, so that's why we want to leave the altar there. And the important part is, again, the Facebook volume. Pastor's facing the altar speaking, we want a -22 for the altars. If he's facing the congregation with his back to the microphone, oh, we got to bump him up to -15 so the people from home on Facebook can hear him. So he'll go through like 2 or 3 of the changes between facing the congregation, facing the altar. After that, we typically move into the Our Father. We're all set up with that because the altar is already on. Pastor's there, so if pastor does the Our Father facing the altar, we're going to want to turn them down. Otherwise, it's going to be too loud. And then we start setting up for communion. And so with communion, there's usually 3 different songs that play, but we're not worried about anybody speaking. So what I usually do is just turn off the pulpit. I do leave the altar on because at this time, since there's such a long period of just music and everybody going up for communion, the camera is focused up on top, so you don't get to see people, and sometimes if you're looking and going, what's going on, where are they at? So I do leave the altar on so people can hear some of the noises, that kind of thing, knowing that there's something going on. You can leave it at -24 because, again, the organ's going. You don't want to blast anybody out at home on the Facebook feed. So after the post-communion hymn happens, then pastor gets up to the front of church, the front of the altar. So again, we can leave these 2 on just in case because he's going to turn around at some point. He first does the benediction towards the altar. So again, leave that microphone on, have them at -22 for the Facebook feed. And then after the benediction, he then turns to the congregation, does the last prayer. So, okay, we're all set there, we're good for him, we have that ready to go. So then what I do is I got to bump them up to -15 for those people at home can hear. And then, okay, the organ's going to play the closing hymn. All right, we're going to turn off the pulpit, just leave the altar so you can hear people sing. You're going to move this back down to -24 for the organ. And then the closing hymn is finished. At this time, pastor does announcements. Well, he typically doesn't do them on the altar, he does them off the altar. So again, we have to turn on all the microphones and usually move them up to -15 to -10 to be able to pick him up, because again, he's so far away and his back's turned to the microphone, those at home have to try to hear him. The announcements happen. For example, sometimes pastor will ask if there's any question or any other thing. Somebody in the congregation will stand up and make a message. I sometimes have to bump that up to -6 just so you can hear somebody in the middle of church because they're so far off the mic. But you got to remember, before pastor starts talking, you're going to want to bring that down, otherwise it's going to be way too loud. Pastor says, everybody says his prayer, everybody's ready to go home, and at that point, we mute the mics, the organ plays for a little bit until the Facebook feed is off, and then we just mute that just like that. And then nothing else you got to do to this besides manually turning it off and then turning off the amplifier.